Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you for coming tonight. I will shortly hand you over to Charles Glass, who's going to chair tonight's discussion. But before I do so, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live this evening. So over to Charlie.
Thank you all for coming. As the evening progresses, you'll be encouraged to ask questions of our various guests, Patrick Cockburn, Robin Blackburn, Ellen Stein, Joe Papp. One thing I would urge you to recall, something I learned many, many years ago here, which is never cross a Cockburn. If you cross one of them, if you malign Claude, Alexander, Andrew, Patrick, any of them, Daisy, any of them, they will swarm over you like a squadron of B-52s, and you will never be able to emerge in public again. And it's one of the great tribal qualities about the Cockburns that I like and admire, is they always come to one another's defense, even posthumously. So just bear that in mind when you ask your questions. Alexander was a good friend of mine, and a valued friend, as are his brothers. I'm a kind of honorary Cockburn myself because I'm a nephew of Charlie Cockburn, Andrew's son, and so I feel I'm part of that little golden circle of defended territory. Alexander was an iconoclast, an eccentric, a genius, bon vivant, polemicist of magnificent proportions, whose personality was as important as his politics. He infused his politics with that love of living and of combat. One of his former lovers told me that when he used to get up in the morning, he would just jump out of bed and say, "I'm Alexander Cockburn and I'm taking on the world." He was the happiest, well, words to that effect. How would you know? You weren't there. Anyway, he was something else. I mean, when he stayed with me, he used to stay with me in Paris, and he was up early, he was out, there wasn't an exhibition or a concert he didn't go to. There weren't people that he didn't corner to talk to and engage in conversation. He was just a force like no one else I've ever known and probably ever will know. And tonight, there are several of us here who want to talk about him, talk about this posthumously published book, which I've spent all day today reading. I started jotting down notes in this notebook, passages I want to quote, but then I practically filled the notebook, so I can't. I'm not going to do too much of it. It's hilarious. The insights are great, but it is so funny. It's so typical of him. I can almost hear him saying these words that you, if you're wise enough to buy this book, that you'll read and enjoy as well. Now tonight we have the youngest Cockburn brother, Patrick, who has been Middle East correspondent for a number of papers, the Financial Times and the Independent, since 1979. And is the author of many books, but relevantly The Occupation on Iraq and a biography of Muqtada Sadr, the Shiite leader in Iraq. Ellen Stein is another friend, and the author of the book That's Not Funny, That's Sick, The National Lampoon and the Comedy Insurgents Who Captured the Mainstream, which came out in June this year. Joe Pfaff, who studied politics and philosophy at Berkeley, as we pronounce it in America, at Berkeley from 1957 to 1966. He also taught at Berkeley, Toronto, and Stanford. He moved in 1975 to Petrolia in Humboldt County, very northern California, which is where Alexander settled, and Daisy, who's living there now, will talk a bit about Petrolia later. Which, I've never been there, but it sounds like a completely deranged place. Robin Blackburn, another very old and close friend of Alexander, teaches at the University of Essex and was teaching at the New School in New York. He's a former editor of the New Left Review, where Alexander used to write, and author of The Making of New World Slavery, The Overflow of Colonial Slavery, Age Shock, Banking on Death, and The American Crucible, among other books. So I want to, because I'm just chairing this, I don't really have much to say, you're very lucky in that regard. I want to let Ellen talk a little bit about aspects of Alexander that not many people know, including his saving of South Beach, Florida.
Well, I have to start.
It's all right, it's a good start, then you can back off and relax.
Okay, well, I'm sort of here under false pretenses because I wasn't a personal friend, but I freelanced for The Voice when Alex was writing for them, so we all sort of basked in his aura. but I was much too intimidated to go say hello. And I wrote for the Nation a bit, and I knew a lot of people who worked for the Nation during the many years that he had his regular column there. The other thing though is when I was growing up or young adult, I read press clips, the press review column he wrote for the Village Voice, and I don't know how many of you know, he wrote it with James Ridgway, I should say, and I don't know how many of you know what the Village Voice was an alternative paper in New York, and in the 70s, the late 60s and the 70s, it had such incredible energy. It had in culture, it had people like Greil Marcus and Jay Hoberman and Andrew Saris and James Wolcott. I don't know if these names mean anything to you, writing for them. It had Wayne Barrett reporting on City Hall. It just was a really must-read and journalistically strong publication. And press clips, now reviews of the press and the press looking at itself are everywhere. But at the time, it was pretty much standing alone. And what Alex brought to it was, I think, this very British thing. He started writing it in 1973, 74. Bite. And Brio, and because the Voice encouraged personal voices, but American journalism on the whole, for those of you who don't know, is very big on being even-handed, which also often leads, as it has we've seen the last few weeks, sort of the dead fight to false equivalency. I mean, the quintessential New York Times headline is Hitler, right or wrong, And this was totally what he was against, and he was one of the first people to also look at what the press wasn't covering, what their agendas were, and who owned them, things like this. And there is a great thing, just a quick example here. When Alex moved to the U.S., the 70s, the mid-70s, was sort of the fag end of the 60s. Nixon had been reelected. This was a big thing because all that idealism in the 60s, first of all, there were all the assassinations, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and so on, 68, 69. And then Nixon's reelected, and it's people, progressives thought, what do we have to do, to wake people up? And it seemed like, no, business can go on as usual. And the drugs had changed from LSD and pot to heroin, and things were getting very sort of dark. New York was about ready to default. The services were falling apart. I know London had long strikes and garbage building up, and New York was in a similar state. And there was a lot of, the country was very polarized, almost as much as it is now. But a lot of the fissures we see in America that are emerging now about alarm at it becoming the political process being controlled by corporations and the environment, being destroyed, and a number of these things were around. These fissures were emerging. Canaries, and there were canaries in the coal mine, like Alex, who was pointing them out even then. And now, of course, the reader's comments in the New York Times reads like the Socialist Worker, but because it's all gone mainstream. But for example, he was very exercised, and rightly so, about the Allende, when Allende was overthrown in Chile in 1973. And here's a typical press clips thing. He said, in general, U.S. editorialists have joined with the Pope and Max Lerner and call the events a tragedy. The nice thing about tragedy is that somehow absolves human beings from responsibility. Beyond that, the general consensus was that, as the New York Times put it, a heavy share of the responsibility for the disaster must be assigned to the unfortunate Dr. Allende himself, the romantic Marxist who, quote, never lost his taste for Scotch whiskey, unquote, had gone too far and divided the nation. It took Richard Gott in The Guardian to point out that Allende was elected with 36% of the vote in the past 3 years, has not lost a single supporter. And he he says that we might have expected intensive investigation, possible U.S. involvement from a press corps, fresh from the triumph and self-congratulation over Watergate, but nothing much has happened. Newspapers review the evidence at their disposal and generally mark that in the absence of evidence, one must assume that the U.S. government played no part beyond a decision not to warn Allende of the impending attack, which it knew of at least 12 hours in advance. And he talks about the background of the U.S. ambassador who was cabling the State Department. There is a considerable variety of ways the military might intervene. On September 8th, Davis, that's the ambassador, flew to Washington to see Henry Kissinger. On September 10th, he returned to Chile. On September 11th, Allende was dead. Of course, Davis may be as pure as a lamb, devoting his waking hours to the study of Chilean church paintings. The U.S. press has not tried hard so far to make the assessment either way of the role of Davis, the institutions he represents. That is very typical of his, backing up, asking the questions other people weren't asking, and backing them up with evidence. So quickly, I just want to go into just one other things. He later, much has been made of the fact that he took positions that weren't consistent with the liberal viewpoint. But I think, as you said, he was an iconoclast. And I was just thinking,
he was also, let us remember, a columnist for the Wall Street Journal.
And
in days when there was a bit more exchange of ideas across platforms.
Or else they recognized that he was willing to, go. And I was, having been knee deep in Lampoon, somebody who was very influenced by him was P.J. O'Rourke, who of course is coming from the right, as opposed to more from the left. Libertarian anarchist, but inspired to his degree of style, but also that urge to deflate liberal pieties and dislike of moderation and mush. And I think that was the big thing. He really didn't like mush. He didn't like conventional wisdom to remain unexamined. And I think so when he, in later life, questioned climate change, I don't even know if he really believed it or if it was so much like, well, everybody, this is like it's a shibboleth, it's got to be questioned. But I just wanted to mention strangely enough, his most lasting or most concrete legacy may be South Beach in Miami, because at one point South Beach was on the verge of being razed by developers. And he wrote a column about it in 1982 in the Village Voice about the effort to save it, which was spearheaded by a woman named Barbara Capitman, who really did all the heavy lifting. And this made a huge impact. And, half the West Village, and people who gentrified the West Village, went down to South Beach and then gentrified that. But it became a destination. And I just want to read what this it did get saved largely because of the awareness he raised about it. And I just want to read a bit from that column because it illustrates so much about what made his writing so terrific. So, first of all, he says, he's speaking about developers in general, a body of creatures who should be chained to a pile of Westway environmental impact statements and thrown into the Hudson. They could alternatively been marched to the site of the late Morosco Theater, given a last cigarette or a last telephone call to Mayor Koch, blindfolded with old theater bills, and then shot. These real estate developers are, of course, swarming all over New York like cockroaches, seeking out with intent to destroy any structures with the least pretension to dignity and grace. Like the Goths massing before Rome or Bomber Command proceeding towards Dresden, real estate developers are now poised to destroy a square mile of Miami Beach and obliterate the most ample reliquary of the Art Deco era. But tell us what you really think, Alex. However, he goes on, and that's Alex in attack mode. But here he is in more positive mode, and I think, as I'm sure other people talk about, he had a great liking for driving around America in big old cars. And that's another thing, I think the affinity with O'Rourke, they don't want anybody saying you can't drive in big cars. And he describes the area that was under threat as Sun, sand, and architecture conspired to create an escape from the Depression. The spirit was one of gaiety, lightness, the swoop of the streamline, and the soothing tone of ice cream and pastel colors. Throughout the square mile are apartment houses ranged along the streets and boulevards, affording glances of intimate courtyards and tropical comfort on the human scale. Amid condo madness, the lava-like torrents of horror carving their way along the coastline of Florida, prison houses of loneliness, emblems of the inhumanity of most architects and developers towards their fellow creatures. Deco Miami is the emblem of a gentler, proper sense of proportion. The architecture and disposition of the district is a paradigm of how the elderly might like to live. Beachfront promenades, safe hotel parlors and cafes, apartment house courts, intimate yet not concealed from that public social vigilance, which is the best protection for the elderly against more youthful predators. Community and social interaction for old people rather than solitude. Well, that just shows you what a writer he was. The irony is, of course, it was saved. It was colonized by young people and fashionistas and Versace wannabes who built a house there. And now it's a terrible place for old people. And developers are building deco-style hotels, very expensive hotels everywhere. Nevertheless, he tied the aesthetic into its social use. And I think that's a very important point about the unity of vision. It wasn't like, well, here's one thing, here's another thing, here's another thing. This is politics, this is aesthetics, this is literature. It all comes together and interacts. And I think, and all done with bite. And I was going to say, I think Murdoch secretly thought he should be a Sun journalist because of his willingness to go for the jugular and his liveliness.
Murdoch did buy the Village Voice while he was there.
I know. He bought the company that oversaw.
And he said, and Alexander said he didn't interfere with him at the time.
So anyway, that's really, yeah.
I'm going to ask Robin about a number of things. One, your friendship with him, which goes back probably longer than anybody here except Patrick, and also the significance to him and his career, and also politics here, of his deciding to leave in '72 and go and live in the States.
Yeah, well, I first met Alexander in the early 60s, in fact about 1960 or 61, and we were in what was, the New Left circle at that period. We weren't yet editors or anything like that. That happened in 63, 64. But so Alexander had a fantastic background. Obviously, Patricia and Claude were there, nurturing him on the virtues of, English literature on the one hand, and sort of communism and standing up for difficult principles on the other. But also, I remember Alexander, he worked for the Review, Ian Hamilton's newspaper. I mean, he was available to work as assistant editor, actually on the TLS, on the New Statesman, which is a much more substantial outfit then, and Hamilton's The Review. But I think for his future journalistic prowess, I think he was also involved with the early Private Eye, and one forgets that Claude actually was worshipped by the editors of the Eye, and
he had a column.
He had a column there, but also they occasionally gave him the whole mag to edit, and invariably they hit the headlines when they did that, because he'd go after the most extraordinary stories, and Alexander was in the background and he was picking up tips and so forth. I remember one of them that he told me is that one could use some of the approach of the Eye to deflate powerful and pompous individuals by, for example, giving them a nickname. And he did that absolutely ruthlessly. And when he started doing it in America, it hadn't quite been done in that way. So, there was. There were lots of liberals who started supporting colonial expeditions of one, or neo-colonial expeditions and imperial exploits of one sort or another, and he baptized them the laptop bombardiers, and somehow it just hit a nerve, and it was a phrase that stuck, rather like Claude came up with the Clifton set. I mean, actually that was prior to private eye. So although we were involved in something we called, or was called, the New Left, and I think Alexander was sort of, quite passionate about reading continental critical theory. You might be surprised to know it, but he would very often take Adorno's Minima Moralia to browse of an evening to sort of sharpen his wits. Although he did that and was interested in the new and the emergence of new radical currents, actually he was quite strongly attached to the old left, and I wouldn't say sentimental about it, but he just thought that there were real values there. That I remember we did a book on trade union militancy, which we got out in 1966, is I think the first book Alexander was involved with, it was very good that Claude was there, but so were also other people who'd fought with him in Spain, British trade unionists, and there was something there about that type of internationalism which he really appreciated, and he didn't like it when sort of the left became too trendy, radical chic, which you might think Alexander was sort of an exponent of. He was very, very chic, but he managed to be, and in this book as an example, I mean, if you were Alexander's editor or publisher, you had to be, just occasionally you would be lashed across the back for some failing and so forth. And so as someone who was involved with Verso at the time, I mean, in the book there's an excellent few paragraphs where he takes Verso to task for having published with great éclat and success a fancy edition of the Communist Manifesto in the year, I suppose, about 1998, just when everybody had said, communism is dead. We produced this, but I think we slightly overdid it, because it was, as Alexander pointed out, it was printed on sort of special vellum paper. It had fancy binding, and
forward by Margaret Thatcher.
It also actually had a quite redundant a bookmarker made of silk. I mean, after all, the Communist Manifesto is not that long. You don't need to really mark where you've finished reading it. And on the cover, it had, and I think this is why we got the criticism from Alexander. It had a picture of a red flag by the sort of Soviet realist artists Comer and Melamed. I mean, the sort of lampoon socialist realists. And Alexander, who had actually introduced us to this very gifted pair of painters, he thought it was going a bit far to put that on the Communist Manifesto, and he said he, for his part, would always keep the old international edition, that the Moscow Foreign Languages Press put out, because it was no nonsense, and it was printed by people who thought, capitalism should be done away with, whereas somehow Verso was just producing another commodity for the market, So he kept us on our toes like that, and the values of the past, when he felt we were, not living up to them. He was fearless, and I think that is really the quality that, in the end, huge numbers of Americans became also British, but sadly, few British publications would be buying Alexander's columns and printing them. But in the US, he had Los Angeles Times, as well as Wall Street Journal, The Nation, The Village Voice. And so there was something there that he had to offer. And I think a little bit of it was, Patricia, writing about Claude, says he had an alien eye, that he was able to see through conventional fallacies and so forth, because he was just a bit distanced. I mean, although Coburn's sort of perhaps part of some strange corner of our British ruling class, but at the other, these particular bunch of Coburns also obviously quite different from it, like Claude being a communist and so. But I think Alexander had some of that alien eye for Americans too, and it's sometimes called contrarianism, although that, I don't think it means he was always, he could be lyrical. It's already been pointed out, and that was part of his allure as a writer too.
And his humour.
And his humour. It had that positive side. But certainly there was the astringent quality and the fearless quality up against real power. And I think he went to the United States in 1972 because that's where the action was. And he also didn't go into university. I mean, an awful lot of the rest of us went into academic pastures. And I think Alexander was after bigger game than you find in a seminar room. You know, he didn't want to engage in. He could have done it, but he just didn't. He wanted something more to do with the real world, and he found it in this, incredible reception that he got to his writings, and his ability to say things about presidents and presidents of great corporations. So the thing that really sticks in my mind is if you start reading this wonderful book, or if you read his earlier books, Corruptions of Empire or Washington Babylon. There in Washington Babylon you have 6 pages on what a scam the Enron Corporation is. This was at a time when even Paul Krugman was writing in the New York Times saying what a wonderful company it was, and I think he took a post as director or some sort of paid job with Enron. But Alexander saw through it with the help of, it was perhaps James Ridgway, I forget. He was very good. If you're a friend of Alexander, he was incredibly good at pumping you for information, and I'm sure all the members of this panel, remember the experience that. But it was his seriousness. He really was concerned about the facts. So although it looked as if he was sitting back and criticizing the press, he wasn't. He was doing it from the standpoint of someone who really wanted to know what went on, and the fact that Patrick was first in Northern Ireland and then in Russia and then in the Middle East, and that Andrew was in Washington. I mean, you can see that coming through at the prose, because the results of telephone calls, he could then draw on that information to strengthen his critique.
Also, in the book in 1995, he was writing about the consequences he predicted for the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act by the Treasury Secretary Rubin and Bill Clinton, which would be a credit collapse in the country, which did happen in 2008.
He was merciless about Rubin, and Rubin, of course, was the real architect of the whole bubble economy. So
he had a lot of insights and foresight.
And his entry on the day after 9/11 is quite interesting. He says, the U.S. is probably going to take it out on these so-called rogue states, which the U.S. intelligence actually helped to found Saddam Hussein and the Taliban.
Now, if I can, Joe, I wanted to ask you about Petrolia and CounterPunch and this whole long period of his life.
Well, Alexander showed up in my life in 1991, and I met him at a dinner of Berkeley socialists who were, my younger brother had gone to Detroit and had spent 15 years working in the Teamster Union trying to create a democratic election of the president. And in 1991, he finally won. They were electing a president, and they were running a man, Ron Carey, the head of the United Parcel Workers. And the socialists, they were all saying that he shouldn't support him because he wasn't a socialist. So I started complaining they were addicted to defeat. They couldn't stand the thought of winning. Here we have a chance of winning the most powerful presidency, the most powerful union in the United States, and they're saying we shouldn't back him. So of course we should back him. Alexander said not a word at the dinner. But as I'm walking out the door, he walks up and says, "You're right. I'm going to come and see you tomorrow." So he showed up the next day. And then we engaged in a lot of polemical writing for the Ron Carey and electing the Teamster president. And Alexander luckily was invited to write a column for the Wall Street Journal, and wrote a column beginning inch by inch and day by day, America's becoming a nation of part-time workers. What they were doing with unions was they'd let all the existing union members over a certain age get a raise, and then have a 2-tiered system, and every newcomer would be a part-time worker, working at $9, $10 an hour in that era. And this column it's probably the most widely read column he ever wrote, because every Teamster in America reproduced it. It was posted in every truck stop in America, every transfer depot, every warehouse. Every day it was torn down. Every day it was put back up. And all of this was done by the workers. None of this was done by organizers or our campaign. And he was never invited to write for the Wall Street Journal again. And there was a follow-up that week of about 5 columns. Every important economist in America tried to refute this argument. No, 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 this is not the case. But we ended up winning that election. And then 4 years later, we won the UPS strike. It's probably the last labor victory in America. And we re-elected Ron Kerry in '96. 5 days after he was elected, he was basically kicked out of office by a little group of bureaucrats, all members of the Progressive Democratic Party of Wisconsin, who wanted to prove how on the level they were. But this was tying together 2 themes. One, Robin mentioning the trade union aspect of Alexander, and Ellen's on polemical victories, columns that actually won a fight. And this was a gigantic fight, that victory. Once you're on his team, you talked about loyalty to Cockburn. It's loyalty to his friends, too. Once you're on the team, you're on the team. And so I was quickly recruited into this kind of as research assistant and helping with things. And then I don't even know the dates of when we first had CounterPunch. First it was the written form, and then online. And so I've been on the board of CounterPunch ever since. And once you're his friend, he would phone me. It'd be a Wednesday night phone. Andrew's coming tomorrow with Leslie. They'll arrive late. I'll have a little snack for them. I'm going to have a barbecue on Saturday. You cook dinner Friday night. What are you going to cook? Oh, I'll roast a chicken. Oh, that's fine. An hour goes by. The phone rings. I'm not sure about roasting chicken. What about poaching chicken? I don't usually poach chicken. I usually roast chicken. Oh, let me send you some recipes. Pretty soon, fax in those days, the fax machine's coming, recipes are pouring through. Then comes the discussion, well, who else are you inviting? You'll probably invite Greg. You shouldn't, because I'm having him set up the barbecue on Saturday. Well, who you should invite is this person and this person and this person. And then this went on for the next 20 years, pretty much. And when he started renting this little tower thing he made, he would phone and say, well, this guest, they might be boring. Let me feel them out before we invite them to dinner. You could go there and rent a room for $100 and be fed sumptuous meals for every day, lunch, dinner, wine, parties. And so that was kind of the social life. Susanna, his girlfriend, when he first was there, said he thinks he has staff. I said, I think he does. I think he does have staff. And it was all done with fun, just incredible fun. So that's how I got involved in all of this. And his parties in Petrolia, extraordinary parties, hundreds of people. He married my son. First, having arranged the marriage, found the girl, set the marriage up, and married them. And then, so I was talking about invitations. Oh, then even where they're going on their honeymoon, he determined that. They're going to Tahiti. They want to go to Hawaii. No, they have to go to Tahiti. Hawaii, they can go to Hawaii anytime. Americans go to Hawaii. Forget it. Didn't Patricia go to Tahiti, perhaps? I think it had to do with Cockburn tradition of going there. So I said, well, I'm doing the invitations. He said, no, invitations. You don't ever have invitations. Why do I not have invitations? Well, because the only reason you have invitations is to exclude somebody. And that person's going to show up anyways. They won't get an invitation, but they'll come. Meanwhile, you'll forget somebody that you should have sent the invitation to, and they won't come, and their feelings will be hurt. No invitations. Instead, seek out the people you think are too shy to come and urge them on, and let everybody else sort it out. That's how the party goes. So some of his parties would involve several hundred people, hundreds. And then they always involved, he had the biggest vinyl collection I've ever seen. So it was always blues and rock and roll. And if you had any pretensions to knowing the history of blues or rock and roll, you could get in big trouble there. All you had to do was say, oh, this was the first rock and roll artist. Oh, you're ridiculous. It wasn't at all. Listen to this. And he'd outpull Ike Turner before he had Ike and Tina in the 1948 or something. You're hearing it. And all played at a volume that was shattering. Daisy can tell you, the windows vibrating, the wall moving, everything. And everyone came to these parties. And I think that's part of why we loved him in America. The great Walt Whitman dream. Where is the table where every man is welcome? Where is the table where we all sit down and eat together and we're all welcome? And Alexander believed in that. He truly believed in the place where we are all welcome. Everyone is welcome to sit. And I think that's part of his secret there. When Andrew came, the local butcher, he had to teach her how to make bangers. He goes to the sausage lady. No, those aren't right. We'll try again. Here's what you do. And this and then, how much bread? No, that was too much bread. No, it's too little bread. So I did give some bangers for Andrew on his last visit. I didn't find a report yet from Andrew whether they're authentic enough or not. But everyone loved him. When we buried him, the man who sold him that Chrysler drove out from South Carolina to be there, and stood holding a piece of chrome he found on the ground from that Chrysler, crying about this piece of chrome off that Chrysler. And I think that, the on-the-road part of this, the famous on-the-road writers of America, John Gunther, Inside USA, whom Alexander loved, Henry Miller, Air Conditioned Nightmare, and, of course, Jack Kerouac. In San Francisco, there's a museum with Jack Kerouac's Hudson. It's sitting there with a sign saying, "Don't touch. The original road dust is still on it." And it had been bought brand new at a dealer. Well, when I go to the farmer's market on Saturday in Petrolia, I see the Chryslers parked there with Daisy driving it, beautifully redone by a painter in Oakland, somebody he found. The leather's all been redone by a Mexican who does leather work. It was not relics. He wasn't on the road like a once in a kind, and his equipment was not relics. It was live, being used, vital. And I'm sure a biographer will eventually figure out how many miles he covered in America. I'm sure it's 250,000. Alex would, at the drop of a hat, drive to Utah or New Mexico. And when you read unlike Kerouac, who was zooming to San Francisco in 4 days or something, Alexander's trip, suddenly there'd be a whim. I must see Laura Bush's hometown. She was a librarian. I'm going to the library and find what book she checked out. What does the librarian think of Laura Bush? I'm going up to see Pedernales River. I got to go see where LBJ lives. I got to go to Odessa. I got to see where the Bushes made their money. What's the Odessa and whatever the other town is. And if you read this, you'll find these incredible adventures of Alexander and the diversions. And if you traveled with him, you went through these diversions. They were incredible. His disappointment if you didn't do one yourself. I'd go to Paris, he'd say, "Be sure and see such and such." I'd come back, he'd look at me. "You didn't go, did you?" "You didn't go, did you?" And he'd almost cry that you didn't do enough that day. How could you only go to one museum in a day? What is wrong with you? There's so much to do. Why aren't you doing it? And so you can imagine, and at these parties, these old ranch families, they all came. The tradesman, the brakeman who worked on his brakes, the radiator man. And if you ever introduced him to somebody, I took him to a Chinese motel I stay at in San Francisco. He goes to the motel. Of course, he goes there and he cooks in it. Things that anyone else would get evicted for. Hot plates. First thing he'd do is redecorate the whole room. he'd come into my room, he'd say, "You haven't done anything to the lighting here." Just a minute. He'd dash back. He'd always bring little drapes with him to hang over all the lamps. He couldn't stand the lighting, the look of the lighting in the room. So you'd go back to that motel, every person in the motel would come up to you. "Is your friend Alexander coming?" The woman who cleaned the room asked you. The man who did the janitorial asked you. The person at the desk asked you. The owner asked you. Everyone in the motel wanted to know where Alexander was and when's he coming back? Is he coming next week? Is he going to be here tomorrow? So it was an extraordinary, I think there's this wonderful line in Thomas Hobbes, "The greatest use of the human mind is to free a man from scorn." And you'd think with Alexander, that didn't mean letting up on the powerful and the well-positioned and the bullies of life. It meant freeing the people that they were humiliating from this humiliation. And everyone he met, a most ordinary person, he saw more in them than they usually saw in themselves. And they loved him for this, for seeing so much in them, seeing so much in the man who fixes your radiator or your muffler or your brakes. Most of us drop the car off and go about our affairs. Alexander knows the whole life story, knows what the man's wife does, knows what his children do. So this was how he so affected himself in America. And my final thought is the politics. All of our lives, I suppose everyone in this room, we've all lived under the doomsday clock. We've been 5 minutes from the end of the world since the atomic bomb. Well, we were 4 minutes to midnight or something. And that's where Alexander came into politics, like many of us, on the anti-nuclear Albert Maston marches, the Easter week marches in England. And it even looked like we were doing something. There was a brief moment when they actually had a test ban. I think it was, 61 or something? It quickly vanished and right back to testing nuclear weapons. But this doomsday clock, they keep changing, it still always remains 5 minutes to midnight, but they keep changing the face of the clock. It used to be nuclear weapons, and suddenly, like Dr. Strangelove, we all learned to love it. Suddenly, it's not important anymore. In 1968 at Stanford, where I taught, a book was published called The Population Time Bomb. And suddenly, there was no way you could blame nuclear weapons on Mexicans, teenage women. You can't blame it on the poor. You can't blame it on blacks. But you can blame the population explosion on them. So the deadlier bomb than the hydrogen bomb was the population bomb. And we have some people we can go after. In that same year, we switched from stopping nuclear weapons, reducing the nuclear weapons of those who had it, to non-proliferation. Suddenly, the people who had all the nuclear weapons were totally okay. It was the ones who didn't have them who were dangerous. We don't want to let it get in their hands. Our hands, perfectly fine. Just consider Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Sarkozy, all made new nuclear submarines, armed with everyone capable of destroying the planet. Each one of those gentlemen did this. There was no discussion of proliferation. No one said, well, gee, 3 more nuclear submarines prowling the Earth, ready to blow us to smithereens. So we went from there. The year he arrived in America, I guess 71, was the year where we were blowing up islands in the Bering Straits with nuclear weapons. This was when the military had quit doing nuclear testing and given it to the University of California, to civilians. Then it became wackier than ever. They suddenly thought, well, we could mine with nuclear weapons, we could build canals, we can build a new harbor in Alaska. We'll blow a whole harbor, just like San Francisco Bay, with a hydrogen bomb.
Firecracker boys.
Unbelievable.
Firecracker boys.
And called it Plowshares program. Plowshares. And so Alexander had this array of targets to hit here. Now, all of us would like to have been debating, utopia and transforming the society and can we have socialism? But that was no longer, there's no question of that in this world. We're now, that's why it's counterpunch. It's not punch, it's counterpunch. We're receiving the blow, and we're trying to just stay alive. And anyways, in 1971, when they were blowing those islands up, the people who tried to take a boat out to stop it, to sacrifice themselves, their boat, of course, didn't work, and they never made it out. But they did see the tide of dead sea otters come floating in. And that's when they invented Greenpeace. They were actually anti-nuke peace protesters who created Greenpeace. And so then we moved on to species are all vanishing, and we have another thing tick on our clock. And then we have our air being destroyed, our water being destroyed, and finally the entire atmosphere of the planet being destroyed. And this clock, with this doom hanging over it, I think is what is the ghastly shadow we've all been living under. And I think it's the major determinant of our politics. And I've always admired Alexander's ability every day, as you say, to leap out of bed and try doing something about it. It's so, the best saying that came out of the 60s was, move your ass and your brains will follow. And sitting at your computer doesn't cut it. It just doesn't cut it. Your ass is just glued there. And no matter how clever your thoughts are, nothing's happening. And I think that's what Alex inspired in everyone, was this energy. To see him stand, he wrote a criticism of the occupation movement, which cost us quite a few subscribers in CounterPunch. But it was Alexander who stood on the steps of Eureka City Hall when the occupation movement was being harassed, with rain pouring down and rain pouring off his face, giving a complete 30-minute speech at their occupation movement. He's the one who stood there, even though he's criticizing it. And I think that's why he inspired all of us and why we loved him so much. But I could go on, so I'll stop.
Patrick, now the hard part falls to you to speak about your brother.
Sure. Alexander was very much a free spirit politically, intellectually, and personally. In fact, I don't think I've ever met anybody who was quite so self-sufficient in every aspect of his life. Our father, Lord Cockburn, believed that the saying that God is on the side of the big battalions is no more than propaganda put out by big battalion commanders with the aim of demoralizing smaller opponents and persuading them that their efforts are ineffectual. Alexander was wholly the opposite of that. He believed in his own effectuality. He believed in the effectuality of others. He believed that the preservation of the status quo, however unjust, depended on persuading people that they were ineffectual. And one of the things I like about Colossal Wreck is that every page crackles with sort of gunfire, very accurately aimed at big battalions and their commanders. And rereading the book this morning, I was struck how often he sort of struck the mark. Here is one event described in the book, which is the date is 17th of December 1997, and Alexander, along with Edward Said, are attending a event in London about coexistence inside Israel and Palestine. Later, everyone gathered at one of those functions the liberal left excel in organizing, in the narrow, noisy basement of an indifferent restaurant, offering dank meatballs to be eaten with one's fingers. I sat down next to Edward to say hello, and almost immediately, a man I'd never previously met and didn't recognize rose up and addressed me directly. Allow me to say, I think you are a fucking arsehole. Before I could ask for clarifying evidence, he dashed from the restaurant. It turned out to be Salman Rushdie. Rushdie was presumably still simmering from criticisms, richly deserved, that I made about him for his disgusting behaviour after the Sivas massacre. Some Turkish secularists had gathered in the town of Sivas to make a public reading from Rushdie's satanic verses. The same sort of Islamic fanatics as support the fatwa against Rushdie then set fire to the hotel in which the secularists were staying, and more than 30 were burned to death. Rushdie promptly denounced the secularists as acting in a manner he had not authorized. It was a chicken-hearted display. This happened a few years ago, Alexander wrote. The Islamic arsonists at that time had just been convicted. I was looking at this, and then I looked at the next passage down, which caught my eye because it was actually an email to myself, dated December 29, to Patrick Cockburn. Subject: Bad King John, proto-Islamo-fascist. Did you know he seriously, the King John, considered becoming a Muslim? I'm reading R.W. Southern's Western Society and the Church in the Middle Ages, Volume 2 of the Pelican History of the Church. In it, Southern notes that King John of England, while excommunicated by the Pope for nearly 4 years, gave serious thought to becoming a Muslim. The steps King John took in this direction were recounted in detail by contemporary chronicler Matthew Paris. But what also strikes me about Alexander's life and writings is how fundamentally serious he was, how judicious in weighing the evidence, how averse to conspiracy theories, how little influenced by conventional wisdom. But at the same time, he was absolutely not a contrarian, somebody mentioned earlier, and always the very word gives me the shakes, actually, because although one people actually like sometimes being called a contrarian, or you see it in publishers' blurbs, which is usually somebody who, in America, perhaps here too, fulfills the role of a licensed jester, sort of capering and criticizing, but often on topics that are not really contentious, while sliding quietly away from those that are contentious and make one serious enemies. I mean, my friend Christopher Hitchens was somewhat like that. I mean, attacking Mother Teresa is not going to lead to a great number of dangerous enemies assaulting one. By the way, one of the funniest pieces in this book is actually amazingly funny, is Christopher going to heaven, meeting Dr. Kissinger and Mother Teresa and other folk up there. Fantastically funny. But Alexander's writings have a sort of sparkle and an originality and an unexpectedness, not because of contrarianism, but because of really convincing arguments, well argued and well written. And because one thing that people haven't said, Alexander was a magnificent reporter. When he wrote, description, I don't think people ever really picked up on this, but it's not easy to do. For instance, one thing about Petrolia is it's one of the world's premier earthquake zones. And Alexander was either at the center of an earthquake or would come back to find significant architectural alterations to his house because of an earthquake. But the descriptions of the earthquake are wonderful. I mean, many people have done this, but seldom so well. I noticed reading generally sort of good reviews of Colossal Wreck, often by people in the center of politics or on the left, but every so often there's a sort of unhappy gasp and an intake of breath by the reviewer in admitting that, or discovering that Alexander didn't have conventional metropolitan views on many subjects like gun control. It always seems to me that these are often completely commonsensical. It's very likely that tens of millions of Americans are going to give up their guns. But often I notice the reviewers just mention this as if this was some strange political disfigurement. It's never argued by the reviewer. But Alexander was always prepared to argue these points, to look at them with originality, and to also with sympathy of thinking if tens of million people think this, maybe there's a reason why they think this. And for all his sort of independent spirit, which would be taken as a sort of haughtiness, he had a sort of humbleness, something that I think Joe was sort of talking about, in talking to absolutely anybody and taking them seriously. And he had something actually which our father Claude had as well, which you'd leave him that they actually disliked very few people and found almost everybody interesting. It sounds rather cloying to say that about anybody, but I remember with Claude you'd leave him with somebody you thought was pretty boring, and they'd come back, and Claude was very good. He's a very good listener, and Alexander wasn't just a good talker, he was a very good listener. You'd find that he'd elicited from somebody you thought pretty tedious some amazingly funny anecdote. And it's not easily done. It takes a certain cast of mind and a certain humbleness and a certain modesty of character to be able to do that, to find everybody so interesting, and to make them feel more interesting to themselves. Of course, the kind of views that he expressed, I think, all led to sort of gritted teeth on the part of the editors of The Nation when they had to publish his thoughts on gun control or some similar topic. But in many ways, the sort of things that Alexander believed in were more in the sort of tradition of Voltaire and the 18th century Enlightenment. He really did think one should sort of defend the rights of unpopular people like the Scientologists to say what they think and not demonize them simply because they're called a cult. And he didn't think, you'd suddenly find a piece defending some Catholic priest, because he thought, here is this guy being accused of child molesting or whatever, who hasn't actually been able to defend himself. These are very simple, old, sort of liberal Voltairean reactions, but he had them, and lots of others didn't. A couple of small points now, and one thing that always amused me, Alexander going to America, that he actually won the reputation for lots of British reporters, radical, incisive British reporters going from radical, incisive British journalism to America and being part of a new wave. Actually, I think there was Alexander, and that was it. I mean, the others I saw arriving in New York, showed a certain care in fitting in with established views and saying things that might lead the editor to shift them from temporary employment to a staff job. But finally, Alexander remained sustainedly radical. And, he took seriously, musingly, the sort of small change of life, like the correct way to cook Irish stew. And not stinting on the barley, he was very insistent on that. And or the minimum weight of equipment needed to go hiking in America, rather than the massive sort of weighty loads that sports shops wish on their customer. But he never lost his sense of the sort of realities of power and domination. And I think Cloth will Wreck is so good because it's a rebirth of this type of work which used to be more common, of being generally critical of the way things are and the powers that be. You have to go back to Marx and Balzac to get a truly vivid sense of the rich as a criminal elite. These giants did bequeath a tradition of joyful dissection of the morals and ethics of the rich, carried on by Veblen, Moody, Wright, Mills, Domhoff, Lundberg, and others. But by the mid-1960s, disruptive political science was not a paying proposition if you were aiming for tenure. A student studying Mills would be working nights at the soda fountain, while the kid flourishing Robert Dahl and writing rubbish about pluralism would get the Grand Fellowship. Why? The rich bought out the opposition. Back in the mists of antiquity, you had communists and socialists and populists who read Marx and who had a pretty fair notion of what the rich were up to. Even Democrats had a grasp of the true situation. Then came the witch hunts and the buyouts, hand in hand. Result, an Enron exec could come to maturity without ever once hearing an admonitory word about it being wrong to lie, cheat and steal, sell your co-workers, defraud your customers. The finest schools in America produced a criminal elite that stole the store in less than a decade.
Thank you very much. In a moment, I'm going to ask Alexander's daughter, Daisy Cockburn, to speak. But first, I just thought maybe we'd take a few questions to any of the panelists, if any of you want to ask anything about Alexander or the book, or indeed anything at all. I know people are always reluctant to be the first, but let's give it a shot. Anybody? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Palash Dave. I was Christopher Hitchens's sometime televisual Boswell, and I wonder if it is possible to be an enthusiast, friend, comrade, to both these men.
I think it may be, well, Patrick has written about Christopher in a very sympathetic way, which Alexander did not do, but because Christopher is the godfather of Henry, Patrick's son, and he was quite a good godfather, as I recall. So there is a redemptive moment for Christopher in the Cockburn family. But maybe Robin would have something to say about Christopher and Alexander.
Well, I think it's one obvious point can be made, which is that I think in a rather awful way, Alexander sort of invented Christopher. He showed him what could be done, but then he went disastrously off message at a certain point and got seduced in all the ways that he really shouldn't have been. So I think, I do actually notice which is in the book, this sort of sketch of heaven, although it's quite, it's certainly sending up Hitchens and his targets, but it's not doing so in an absolutely totally vicious fashion. Would you agree, Patrick?
No, it has a certain sort of, it's sharp, but it also has a certain sort of affection and tolerance about it. Is that right?
I think Patrick has put his finger on it, and
it's not soppy. I mean, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And the strange thing is, and I got this from both of them, that they used to meet intensively in the sort of East Village, I suppose, somewhere between the Village Voice and the Nation, back in the 80s. And there were occasions when Alexander was about to be fired from the Nation for some supposed monstrosity, and Hitchens actually did stick up for him. I mean, I would say that, and I think there's this slight, but that doesn't. I do think politically they were still very much totally at odds with one another, and I don't think there'd be an element of personal regard there, and I think it's coming. Rather complex picture, and a quite accurate picture of Alexander is emerging, that he wasn't just the sort of savager of people. But I don't think it would have stopped him from being extremely vitriolic if he felt that was needed,
As with Rushdie.
I don't think he ever had any affection for Rushdie, but for Hitchens he did have some time in the 80s, and I think he was also angry that Christopher was misusing this role that he'd helped to create, so he would be uncompromising politically. But Hitchens also used to claim, and maybe Patrick can confirm this, maybe Daisy knows. Actually, they used to speak on the phone. According to Christopher, they used to speak on the phone long after they were supposedly, completely persona non grata with one another and not on speaking terms at all.
Did you want to?
I think they were sort of not on speaking terms, which was one of the... It made telephonic communication a bit difficult. But no, I did talk to... They did talk before Christopher died, I think. And... because I think they're in the same hospital at one point.
Well, right at the end, he said to me, "Have you read Hitch?" And I said, "Oh, no." And he said, "You should. There's a lot of good things in there. The autobiography." And I think also, he was not... If he liked... I mean, his friends were treated pretty roughly, too. I think... I remember a dinner where Alexander and I were savaging each other, and Daisy and her friend... were looking at each other like, "Oh my God, is this the end of a friendship?" And the next morning, it's ridiculously early, he usually phoned around 6 a.m., he'd phone and he said, "Now about last night, I've done a little research. You were right about this, but as usual, you went too far on it." So I think, like he said, there's a wonderful thing about when he does, everyone should read the analysis of Bill Clinton's inaugural speech, where he says that civility is such a disgusting word. We need civilization, not civility. The Athenians had civilization. Go read the Melian debates. They were not civil. They argued strenuously and vociferously at each other, and that's what's required. We don't need, what do you call it, coercive harmony, is what he called it. The coercive harmony of fake civility. And I think his friends liked it. I don't know.
I remember that in later years, particularly over Iraq, Alexander became a great friend of Taki's. Unexpected political marriage, but they both saw eye to eye on the American empire and the evils of what that invasion would and did bring. So he lost Hitchens, he picked up Taki. Anyway, I'll take another question if anybody has one. Yes, please.
Yeah, following on that, my name's Ian Bowl. Yeah, I first met Alexander in '68, I think, in Grosvenor Square and in the Gate in Notting Hill. He was a great cineast, and sometimes used to see 5 films a day. He said he would often do that. And then I expatriated and got to know him in California, and was at his table at Petrolia at one time with Joe. I have to commend Joe as the coffee roaster extraordinaire. I strongly commend Gold Rush coffee beans. They're very big in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you, Joe. Now, I've got a question, and it's about the duopoly of Hitchens and Cockburn in the 80s, among liberals and left liberals in the United States. The Nation, as those of you who don't know, was the kind of conscience of the Democratic Party, and Alexander, of course, was well to the left of that, although, of course, he had opinions that, confused most of the left as well. So my question would be, and I've often wondered this, how was it that, given the incredible efflorescence of radical countercultural publishing, that these two Brits managed a kind of monopoly? They were the alternating columns that were required reading in the US for a whole decade. It's a really interesting phenomenon. What happened to American journalism might be one question. Maybe if you'll allow me, I would like just to quote, after he died, in the week that he died, perhaps, Donald Nicholson Smith, who was a denizen of Notting Hill and didn't know Alexander well, but he said, he summed up the feelings of a lot of us, I think. Donald, some of you might know, who was one of the king mobsters and a great translator, moved to Paris and then ended up in New York. And Donald wrote this, and I think it's quite profound in giving the feeling for many people, many of those who read CounterPunch, but not just. So Donald said this on hearing of Alexander's death. It's not my American expatriation, roughly parallel to his, nor some residual British chauvinism that has made Alexander Cockburn my very favorite left journalist in the United States over the last 4 decades. On paper, I might have expected to find him politically uncongenial with his deep Stalinist background and strong ties to the Sibylline orthodoxies of the New Left Review. But not at all. He became a kind of standard for me. I followed his columns always. I had to measure my own thoughts against his, and many a time it was mine that I found wanting. At other times I could not follow naturally, but there was nothing bought and sold, ever, about his relentless polemical and investigative campaigns. When he was disgracefully sacked from the Village Voice in the 80s, we laughingly launched a defense committee for the critical support of Alexander Cockburn. And despite our mildly satirical intentions, were quite unable to keep our tongues in our cheeks for long. Happily, Alexander managed to stay up on his magnificent soapbox for many, many years thereafter. Few voices in this country, and that's Donald talking about the United States, have wreaked so much damage on those who are the enemies of all of us. That speaks for many of us.
For your question about Hitchens and Alexander, I might turn to Joe because you are living in America and following their writings and in American reaction to them. What do you have an answer to that?
No, I don't. The question why there was no radical American journalism left, and what happened to Bob Scheer, and I think Alexander discusses this demise, but when was the last? I guess A.J. Liebling or somebody. You'd have to go back pretty far to find.
Is he stone?
Huh?
Is he stone?
Andrew Cockburn, Alexander.
Andrew, yeah, his friend Andrew. And
there are a few.
I'm wondering if maybe it was the decapitation in the academy of the left, like McCarthyism. If you think of Alexander and Hitchens both trained in a fairly rigorous way in a British system which still had, there were radical models that you could work from. I don't know. It's a mystery. I mean, it's fascinating the grip they had.
But I'll take one more question, then I want to ask Daisy to speak.
Yeah, Afshin Ratansi, a CounterPunch contributor. I can vouch for Patrick's story about Rushdie because I actually was there at that 1997 event when he. Alex was talking to. It was some Isaiah Berlin type academy liberal philosopher. I think it was an LRB event. But my question is, how and why did he keep his illness secret?
Don't really know. I think he didn't want to be treated as being ill. He didn't want people to see him as being sick. He also, he's somebody who's physically very strong. He didn't like the idea of being sick either. I think there are reasons like that. And also hope that he'd get well. So I think that there were sort of reasons like that, which probably are sort of commoner than one imagines.
I'd like to introduce Daisy Cockburn, Alexander's daughter, who, why don't you come and sit where I am, actually. Daisy Cockburn, who's been living in Petrolia the last few years of her father's life and is now settled in Petrolia, more or less, good old Petrolia, and wants to say a few words.
Sure, I'm not sure I can hold this and read at the same time, but I'll try.
I can give you mine.
Oh. Thanks. So I'm going to read just a few extracts from the book, short extracts, and then we can all go and have a drink. But I hope that you've really got a bit of a feel for who my father was as a person, as well as everything else. And there's so many small things that were triggered off by everybody's talks. Patrick talking about his insistence on when he became interested in the least weighty hiking gear, he started to rip the tongues out of his trainers. And I actually have a cupboard of something like, I don't know, maybe 50 pairs of pumas with no tongues. And it's such an incredible installation that I haven't been able to do anything with it yet. But I'm hoping that perhaps the Serpentine Gallery might be interested. But there are quite a few other installations that I have around the house that really speak of his passions, obsessions, and interests, and also deep aesthetic sense. And also his particular views on, Irish stew, how much barley, etc. I can barely fry an egg without hearing his voice. No, you've got to slowly, and so there are so many rituals that are part of the day, part of my day, that are infused with his personality and his views, particularly as I spent the last year of his life in Petrolia with him. So I kind of got to see those daily rituals and to appreciate his daily his language, which is one of the main delights of this book. He loved Woodhouse for his language. He loved incredible, joyful, extraordinary, original, exciting language, and his everyday language was as exciting. So it wasn't pompous or self-consciously theatrical, but it was somehow robust and never sloppy. So usually you talk to people and there's a bit of and with him there just wasn't that. It wasn't scholarly or academic. He didn't particularly like academic language, or it was always laughing at words like paradigm or dialogue. Or when I was at university, it was a nightmare because I started using pretentious language, and he just just laughed. And so he was quite harsh. And when I accused him of devalidating me for not liking Adrian Rich's prose, it was a very bad moment. His laughter was seriously humiliating. So it wasn't all fun and games, but I now really appreciate his sort of muscular and robust approach to language. So on that note, the first extract I'm going to read is, all the extracts are exciting language-wise, but this is the first entry in the book, and it's taken from a letter that he wrote to me in 1995. And his letters were like receiving a mini missive from, William Hazlitt or something really exciting like that. The Remington type, and the kind of always sort of. Well, anyway, I'm not going to ramble on about it. I'm just going to read it. So this is just part of a letter, and he is describing one of the processes in the renovation of his house, or the creation of his magical, whimsical Garden of Eden in Petrolia. And this was the garage, which was a very ordinary garage, and is now not very ordinary. So he's describing the renovation of that. Last year, a Mexican muralist with nothing to do was here. And so I got him to do an 18-foot by 8-foot ceiling mural on the roof of my garage become library. Roof meaning ceiling. I said it should more or less address the theme of the meaning of the universe. Oh, sorry. So there were horses on the vault of heaven, and then, being Mexican, he had a peasant crucified to a corn cob, and lower down a great big skull, and lower down Adam and Eve looking really bummed out. Then some nice birds and an owl with wings extended. After a year of looking at this, I bumped into Daniel the painter back from Mexico and said that I was Anglo-Irish, not Mexican. And so I wanted everything a bit more bushy-tailed. The peasant not crucified but waving a machete, no skull, and Adam and Eve looking excited as though they were off on a lovely picnic. He digested all this with relatively good grace, and his American wife wagged her head in strong agreement. I felt like Pope Julius telling Michelangelo to give up this idea of God handing Adam a formal note of contract and just have the hands reaching out. Know what I mean, Mike? Then what about, instead of the skull, the spirit of the eternal feminine? Daniel immediately wanted a Mayan-type woman crouching in eternal toil and suffering. So I said, no, and dug up a painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Prosperia, one of those pre-Raff girls, all eyes and raised shoulder and haunted mien, and said, try this one for the pose. Then he needed a face, so I think you are going to end up on the ceiling of the library, holding a Humboldt lily, which he's made the size of a gladiolus. The lily will have to be curbed, and the eternal feminine is a bit at odds with everything else, so we'll have to see. I hope you survive the final cut, as they say in Hollywood. So that's an example of the kind of letter that I would receive here in London from Petrolia, and I could only imagine what was going on over there. So it was very exciting. And the other theme that runs through here that I'm just going to pick up on is, is his love of old cars and his relationship with cars and mechanics and the people that sold him the cars and everything else. And I, having not driven, anyway, I won't go into my driving history, but I now am driving his car around, one of his old cars, and it's a very noticeable 1959 bright red Chrysler Imperial convertible. What can you do? Anyway, so I'm driving it around the hills of Petrolia, and I go into the nearest town, which is called Ferndale. And I haven't gone to this particular garage yet because I've heard the gas is overpriced. But I stop off at Tipples, and Jerry comes out and says, that must be Alex's car. And I say, yep, it is. And so immediately he has a story to tell that he used to be the AAA coordinator for that area, which is like AA, or what's it called here? AAA. Anyway, so, and he said that he got a call from the main AAA office, wherever it was, somewhere else in Northern California, saying, we've had a distress call from a gentleman on the Wildcat, which is the road that leads from Ferndale to his house in Petrolia, and can you get out there and see what's up? And so Jerry said, well, can you tell me anything about the situation? He said, yeah, it's a guy in a red truck, and he says he has a wild grizzly in the back of the truck. And so Jerry was, oh, that must be Alex. So Jerry drives to the Wildcat, finds my dad there, and what he actually has in the back of his truck is a wire grizzly, which he has commissioned from a wire sculptor, of course, to put in his garden. So it's 8-9 foot. It's a fantastic sculpture, and it's made of wire. So anyway, the next morning, Jerry was woken up at 7 o'clock in the morning by this other office saying, we've all been really worrying, what happened to the grizzly? And so that's just one of those kinds of stories that I would come across, fairly frequently. And so just to read one more short extract from his story about being stopped by the police in one of his cars. I commute fairly regularly between Petrolia in Humboldt County and Berkeley, a distance of about 350 miles. The other day I was driving a 1964 Newport station wagon north and was astounded suddenly to see a red light go on behind me, somewhere near Ukiah, and a pissy young CHP officer on the short side come around to the passenger door, hand on holster. By the time a police officer reaches the passenger door, any prudent driver should already have license, registration, and proof of insurance held between finger and thumb, with both hands high on the driving wheel and no sudden movements, thus hopefully averting what we may term the Diallo effect. I did everything wrong, the reason being that the Ziploc bag holding my papers was under the driver's seat, and so contrary to procedures just outlined, I was bowed down with my head under the steering wheel trying to find the bag. The officer stared tensely as I finally surfaced with the bag and leaned over to try and get the passenger door open. This is a station wagon that had been sitting in a field for the preceding 6 years. All the door locks, except for the driver's side, had frozen. There had been a wood rat nest in the glove compartment, which is why the papers were under the seat. The passenger door handle broke when I tried to wrench it open. Finally, I got the passenger window down. The cop said, as though already testifying in court, that he had been heading south, rounding a bend, and he had seen me come the other way, overtaking a car, as I did so, in the outside lane. At this point, the CHP officer will usually have sized you up, figured you are no major menace to civilization, not drunk, and computer check on license pending, maybe not the big catch of the evening. Courteous behaviour by the driver usually yields rewards, with the ticket written up for 72 miles per hour instead of a reckless driving citation for going over 90. I was polite, peppering my remarks with officer. It got me nowhere. So, yeah, the extraordinary things have happened in the car, in various cars with him. Brakes failing on the freeway. I looked at him and he said, "Shit." And I said, what is it? What is it? What is it? Stay calm. And it veered up a bank and it was all fine. And his calmness was kind of, important in those situations and helped all of us out. Anyway, I'm not going to ramble on with endless stories, but it really is a fantastic book. It's really worth reading. I hope you managed to get a copy, and great to see everybody, and thank you very much. Thanks to everybody. Okay. Oh.
I think we're going to take a couple more questions, then everyone has to buy a copy of the book. And now Daisy, so you can ask Daisy questions as well. Any question? We didn't run out. We only had 4 questions. We can't have exhausted your curiosity. Alan, help me. No. Yes.
Going back to this point about how Christopher and Alex dominated the American journalistic scene, I'm wondering whether, was it because the top American journalists went sort of vertical into hardcore investigative journalism, which kind of diverted them from the bigger scene? I mean, there's been some great American journalists in the last 30 or 40 years, but they've been investigative right down to the core of various issues. And maybe they lost the perspective of the entire canvas of the American scene.
Maybe Alan would take that.
Well, I actually think the reason when they dominated it, they dominated a sector of it. USA Today readers were not that aware of who they were. But I think it's because they took this fairly British bracing approach, and that's the difference. The American journalism tends to be polite, and there's a certain fear of giving offense. And actually, it's been adopted by Fox, the bracing approach, without the facts to back it up, unfortunately. But I think it was, and they weren't afraid to be funny, but not like ha-ha funny, but with with wit, and again, backed up by, as Patrick said, very clear analysis and solid research. But it was the style and the brio that they crackled in a way that most American journalists didn't. And I think there was the bit of the, oh, I love your accent going on as well. That was part of it too.
Another question? Well, I'd like to ask Daisy, what's the genesis of the book? I mean, it's not clear from the introduction how it came about. It is partly diary, partly letters, partly some exchanges.
I think Joe, actually, and maybe even Patrick, might know more about this than me. I mean, I do know that he was pulling it together, and it's pretty much how he wanted it. That he was, pulling it out of things that he'd written during all of those decades. And I think that he'd really wanted a substantial sort of...
legacy?
Well, I don't know, because I think he was planning it way before he knew he got sick. So it's not really obviously it's published posthumously, but it's not really a collection that's been put together posthumously. It's very much what he had in mind.
And he had in mind a sort of diary?
Yeah, I think so.
Is it from a diary? Is there an original diary?
He didn't sit down and write a diary, but because he wrote so many thousands of words a day for 45, 50 years, his writing was a diary. And he had a diary in CounterPunch every Friday that people waited for and was a great joy to read. So I think he saw his writing as a kind of diary, and that's why he would have put it in this format, and also, of course, because it relates completely to the events and the time frame of what he's describing. So I think it's just possibly one of the best ways for him. The Golden Age is in Us is a fantastic book, and that's also in diary form on that table.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Please.
Well, that's, I mean, you say it casually, like, oh, he wrote several thousand words a day for 45 or 50 years.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, did he ever find it difficult? And B, where did that work ethic come from?
I don't know if it was, I think it probably came from Claude and from, that he came from a family of writers already, and that he just had a tremendous amount of physical energy apart from anything. I mean, it was ridiculous how much energy he had, and by 5:30 in the morning his eyes were like, kind of busting open, and he was there on his, initially typewriter and then laptop, and just thumping away. And he worked so hard, and he, for that last year of his life, I really saw how hard he worked and how much he wrote, how many words were coming out. And he really, I don't think he ever dried up. He certainly would sometimes have days where he'd be constructing it in his head, and then he would have to get it clear first in his head, and then it would come out.
Would I be right in thinking, I mean, he, in company, he seemed to have an amazing ability, roughly around 9 o'clock, to sink into a deep sleep.
In the evening?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say even
And
early,
that must be a great gift, especially if you're going to be up at 6 o'clock in the morning.
That's right, you would hear the gentle snore.
I think we have a picture of Andrew and Alexander both asleep holding glasses in their hand.
Yeah, it runs in the family for sure.
Not spilling.
No, that's...
Yeah, I used to talk to Alexander very early in the morning. I mean, he's the only person in the States you could ring up that early and have a live voice on the other end. But also, I also used to keep in mind how close I was to the deadline for his column, because then you'd know that things you told him in confidence, a bit of them would appear, or would the entire transcript of the conversation turn up in sort of 2 days later.
Well, in the absence of any further questions, I want to thank Patrick and Robin, Ellen, and Joe, and especially Daisy for speaking to us tonight. And I really do expect everyone to buy at least one of those books before he or she walks out of the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.